They threw my life into the dirt, literally. My husband and his mother screamed about betrayed, their faces twisted with rage. As I watched them toss my belongings onto the lawn, one thought kept repeating in my head. They have no idea what I'm about to do next. What would you do if everything you built was ruined? Stick around to find out how I turned heartbreak into the ultimate comeback. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story too. My husband and his mother tossed my belongings into the front yard as the neighbors looked on in shock. I stood there, shivering in the brisk autumn wind, clutching a single duffel bag as tears streamed down my face. My voice cracked as I begged him to stop, but Michael didn't even flinch. His mother's voice was the only thing I could hear, sharp, venomous, and loud enough to attract the attention of every single neighbor on the block. You should have thought about the consequences before sneaking around, she shouted, her face flushed with triumph. Michael, please, I pleaded, stepping closer. Can we just talk about this? It's not what it looks like. Michael didn't even glance in my direction. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like he might shatter his teeth. He threw another handful of my clothes into the yard, my favorite jacket landing in a pile of damp leaves. The humiliation was unbearable, but the pain of his cold indifference cut even deeper. You've done enough talking, he finally said, his voice low but firm. I'm done listening to your lies. I stood frozen, unable to think of anything that would stop this nightmare from unfolding. My neighbors whispered to each other, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others outright gawking as though I were the evening's entertainment. And in the background, Michael's mother kept feeding the flame. Good riddance, I say. A woman like you has no place in this family, she spat, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I was dirt under her shoe. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but no words came. What could I say? How could I explain what led to this moment, this disaster, without sounding like the villain they already believed I was? 6 months ago, my life looked entirely different. Michael and I had been the perfect couple, at least to anyone looking in from the outside. He had a steady job as an architect, and I'd built a small but thriving photography business. We lived in a beautiful house his parents had gifted us as a wedding present, an attempt by his mother to keep us close, both figuratively and literally. They lived just down the street, and as his mother found every excuse to drop by unannounced. Blair, she'd say with a tight smile as she scanned my kitchen like a hawk. It's so nice to see you keeping the house tidy for my son. I was worried about that when he first married you. I'd learned to bite my tongue when it came to her condescension. Michael always dismissed it as harmless, saying things like, "That's just how she is," or "Don't let her get to you." But her words always lingered, festering like tiny splinters. The cracks in our marriage had started small. Michael's work hours grew longer, and he spent more time at the office than at home. I tried to be understanding, but his absences began to feel personal, like a rejection I couldn't quite put into words. Whenever I brought it up, he brushed me off. "You know I'm doing this for us," he'd say, leaning over his laptop without looking up. "You should be glad I'm working so hard to give you a good life." "But I don't want money or things," I'd reply, my voice trembling with frustration. "I want you." That was the first argument we'd ever had that ended with him walking out of the house. It wasn't long after that I met Daniel. It had been a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in my favorite cafe, editing photos on my laptop. The cafe was quiet, save for the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of spoons against ceramic mugs. Then he walked in, tall, confident, with an easy smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. He ordered a cappuccino and took the seat across from mine, the only empty one left. At first, I barely noticed him, but when my laptop froze and I let out a frustrated sigh, he leaned forward. "Looks like you could use a break," he said with a grin. "Mind if I join you?" I hesitated, but there was something disarming about his presence. He had a warmth that drew people in, the kind of energy Michael used to have before life wore him down. We started talking, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. He asked about my work, my interests, and even remembered the name of the book sitting next to my laptop. By the time I stood to leave, my cheeks ached from smiling. He slipped me his business card, saying he might need a photographer for his marketing firm. But the look in his eyes told me his interest wasn't purely professional. The rain had stopped by the time I walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the card in my hand. My heart raced, not with guilt, but with an unfamiliar excitement I hadn't felt in years. I tucked the card into my wallet, telling myself it was nothing. After all, it wasn't a crime to talk to someone, was it? But that encounter stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the cafe at the same time, hoping to run into him again. When I finally did, it felt like fate. "I thought I'd never see you again," he said, his smile widening as he pulled out the chair across from mine. I laughed nervously. I'm a creature of habit, I guess. From then on, it became a routine. Our conversations started innocently enough, but there was a connection between us that neither of us could ignore. Daniel was attentive and kind, qualities that had become foreign to me in my marriage. He noticed the small details about me, the way I stirred my coffee, the books I kept in my bag, and made me feel seen in a way Michael hadn't in years. One afternoon, he touched my hand as he reached for the sugar. It was a fleeting, accidental brush, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks burning. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite identify. "It's okay," I whispered, though the thundering of my heart said otherwise. That night, as I lay in bed next to Michael, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. His smile, his laugh, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. I turned my back to Michael, staring at the darkened wall as guilt and desire waged a silent war within me. Back in the present, Michael's mother yanked the last of my things out of the house, a photo album I'd painstakingly put together of our early years together, and flung it onto the pile with a sneer. "You brought this on yourself, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I swallowed the lump in my throat, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry again, but as I stood there staring at the wreckage of my life scattered across the lawn, one thought kept running through my mind. This isn't over. The rain started to drizzle as I gathered my scattered belongings from the front lawn. My fingers trembled as I picked up the photo album, its corners bent and soaked through. Michael stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression colder than the storm clouds above us. His mother, ever the shadow behind him, leaned against the doorframe with a smug look on her face. "Don't bother coming back, Claire," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Michael deserves someone better, someone who won't disgrace this family." My hands clenched the photo album tightly, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to scream, to throw her words back in her face, but instead I forced my voice to remain calm. "You don't know the full story," I said, my gaze fixed on Michael, hoping to find some trace of the man I once loved. "If you'd just listen." Michael cut me off, his voice firm and final. "I've heard enough. Leave, Claire. I don't want to see you again." His words hit like a physical blow. My legs felt like they would give out beneath me, but I stood my ground, refusing to crumble in front of them. "You think you're so perfect," I snapped, my voice shaking with suppressed anger. "You think you can just erase me like I never mattered?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His mother, however, was more than willing to fill the silence. "Erase you. You did that to yourself the moment you decided to throw everything away for some cheap thrill." My heart pounded in my chest as I bit back the words I desperately wanted to scream. "You don't know what he's done." But no matter how much I wanted to expose his hypocrisy, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that fight. Not here, not now, with an audience of neighbors pretending they weren't watching from their windows. I turned and walked away, clutching the damp photo album to my chest. The rain blurred my vision, mixing with the tears I refused to let fall. I threw my belongings into the trunk of my car, the broken pieces of my life shoved hastily into bags and boxes. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there a moment longer. Hours later, I found myself parked in a dimly lit motel parking lot on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered vacancy in bright red letters, casting an eerie glow on the wet asphalt. I sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the steering wheel. My hands gripped it tightly. Finally, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my duffel bag and made my way to the front desk, avoiding eye contact with the bored-looking clerk as I handed over my credit card. The room was small and smelled faintly of bleach, but it was clean and, more importantly, it was mine. At least for now. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sank down beside it, the weight of the day pressing down on me like a physical force. For the first time since the ordeal began, I let myself cry. I cried for the life I'd lost, for the man who once loved me, and for the woman I no longer recognized in the mirror. The sobs racked my body, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. When the tears finally stopped, I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over Daniel's name in my contacts list. He had texted earlier, asking if I was okay, but I hadn't responded. What could I say? That my husband had discovered everything and thrown me out of the house? That I had nowhere to go and no idea what to do next? Before I could change my mind, I hit call. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice warm and familiar. Claire, he said, his tone laced with concern. I've been worried about you. Are you okay? The dam broke again and the words spilled out in a rush. I told him everything. About Michael, about his mother, about the scene in the front yard. He listened without interrupting, his steady breathing a lifeline in the chaos. I'm so sorry, he said when I finished, his voice filled with genuine regret. You don't deserve any of this. Maybe I do, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I made my choices. I knew the risks. Out. No, he said firmly. You made a mistake, Claire. That doesn't mean you deserve to be treated like this. You're human. We all are. His words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, and for the first time all day, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I wasn't as irredeemable as Michael and his mother wanted me to believe. Where are you now? Daniel asked. A motel, I said, on the edge of town. You want me to come over? I hesitated, torn between the comfort of his presence and the fear of what it might mean, but the loneliness was unbearable and I didn't want to face it alone. Yes, I said finally. When Daniel arrived, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He knocked softly on the door, and when I opened it, his eyes searched mine, taking in the dark circles and tear-streaked cheeks. Without a word, he stepped inside and pulled me into a tight embrace. For a moment, I let myself melt into him, burying my face in his chest as his arms wrapped around me. He didn't ask questions or offer empty platitudes. He just held me. And it was exactly what I needed. I brought something, he said after a while, pulling away just enough to reach into his jacket. He handed me a small bag of takeout, the smell of warm food making my stomach growl. You didn't have to do that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I wanted to, he replied with a small smile. You've had a rough day. You shouldn't have to worry about anything else. We sat on the edge of the bed, eating in comfortable silence. The simple act of sharing a meal felt strangely intimate, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. Thank you, I said softly when we finished, for being here. Always, he said, his hand brushing against mine. The spark from earlier was still there, but this time it felt different, less urgent, more steady. It wasn't just desire, it was something deeper, something that made me feel safe. As the night wore on, we talked about everything and nothing, our words filling the empty spaces in the room. And for the first time since my world fell apart, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could piece it back together. Let me know if you'd like me to proceed with the next 1,000 words. By the time Daniel left the next morning, the sun had begun to peek over the horizon, casting golden streaks across the motel parking lot. He had stayed with me through the night, not in the way Michael or anyone else might assume, but as a steady presence that kept me from drowning in my own sorrow. Take today to rest, Claire. You've been through enough. And if you need anything at all, you call me, okay? I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. As I watched him drive away, I realized just how much I'd come to rely on him in such a short span of time. It was both comforting and terrifying. Michael's words from the night before echoed in my mind. You've done enough talking. I'm done listening. But what if he wasn't? What if there was still a chance to salvage something, even if it wasn't forgiveness? I wasn't ready to give up yet, not on my life. The hours crawled by as I tried to make sense of the mess I was in. I sat cross-legged on the motel bed, surrounded by piles of my hastily packed belongings. My phone sat beside me, mocking me with its silence. No calls, no texts, not from Michael, not from anyone in his family. It was as though I'd already been erased from their lives, just like his mother had said. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this story. More to Michael's anger than just my betrayal. Over the past year, there had been moments, subtle, fleeting, that made me question his own fidelity. The late nights at work, the hushed phone calls, the way he avoided looking me in the eye when he talked about certain clients. I had pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. Now I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that afternoon, I found myself parked in front of our house, or I suppose Michael's house now. My stomach churned as I stared at the familiar front door, half expecting his mother to burst out and start shouting again. The curtains were drawn and the driveway was empty. For once, I was grateful for Michael's long hours at work. I still had my key. My hand trembled as I slid it into the lock, half hoping it wouldn't fit, that Michael had already changed it. But the door clicked open, and I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The house was eerily quiet, as though it had been holding its breath since I left. The living room was pristine, not a single cushion out of place. Michael had always been meticulous about the house, a trait I'd once admired but now found suffocating. My eyes darted to the small pile of mail on the counter. Most of it was junk, but one envelope caught my attention, a credit card statement addressed to Michael. I hesitated for a moment, guilt prickling at the edges of my conscience. But then I thought about the way he had humiliated me in front of everyone, how he hadn't even given me a chance to explain. I told myself I had a right to know. Flipping through the pages, my heart sank as I noticed several charges I didn't recognize. Fancy restaurants, hotel stays, even a jewelry store. None of them matched our shared calendar or anything he'd ever mentioned to me. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. Michael hadn't been as innocent as he'd pretended. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear the door open behind me until it was too late. "What the hell are you doing here?" Michael's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. I spun around, clutching the statement to my chest like a shield. His eyes narrowed as he stepped inside, his jaw tightening when he saw what I was holding. "That's private," he snapped, snatching the paper from my hands. "You have no right. And you think you had the right to throw me out like garbage without even listening to me?" I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. "I made a mistake, Michael, but so did you, didn't you?" His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. You don't get to play the victim here, Claire. You're the one who cheated. You're the one who ruined us. I ruined us? I stepped closer, my hands shaking. What about you? The late nights, the lies, the charges on this card, do you think I didn't notice? Do you think I didn't wonder? He looked away, his silence more damning than any confession could have been. My heart sank as I realized just how far we'd both fallen. Why didn't you just tell me? I whispered, my voice cracking. Why didn't you just admit that things weren't working? He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion etched into every line. Because I thought we could fix it. I thought if I worked harder, made more money, gave you everything you wanted, it would be enough. But it was never enough for you, was it? Michael, all I ever wanted was you, I said, tears streaming down my face. But you've been gone for so long, I don't even recognize you anymore. For a moment, the anger between us faded, replaced by a shared sense of grief. But just as quickly, the wall between us snapped back into place. You need to leave, he said, his voice cold and detached. I can't do this right now. Michael, just go, Claire, please. I drove away in a daze, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me like a physical burden. My mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about my mistakes. Michael had been running from something too, and whatever it was had destroyed us long before Daniel entered the picture. By the time I reached the motel, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the parking lot in shadows. I climbed the stairs to my room, my legs heavy with exhaustion. Inside, I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling as the events of the day replayed in my mind. I didn't know what to do next. My marriage was over, my reputation in tatters, and the man I had once trusted with everything had turned into a stranger. But as I lay there in the silence, a new determination began to take root. Michael and his mother thought they'd won. They thought they could write me off, erase me from their lives like I'd never existed. But they were wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. The previous day's events had left me broken, but also angry, not just at Michael, but at myself. I had allowed this to happen, to let his mother walk all over me, to ignore the signs that our marriage had been disintegrating for years. But most of all, I was angry that I had let myself be erased so easily. It was time to take my life back. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and set it on the small motel desk. The glow of the screen lit the room as I started drafting an email to Michael. I needed him to know that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I wasn't sure if he'd even read it. Michael, you think you know the whole story, but you don't. I made mistakes and I owned them, but you weren't blameless either. If you want this to be the end, fine, but at least have the decency to face the truth. Call me when you're ready to talk. I don't know if I deserve your help, I said quietly. I've made so many mistakes. Stop, he interrupted, his tone firm but kind. You're not defined by your mistakes, Claire. No one is. I looked up at him, tears brimming in my eyes. Why are you so good to me? He smiled, a hint of sadness in his expression. Because I know what it feels like to lose everything, and I know how much it helps to have someone in your corner. That evening, I returned to the motel feeling lighter, as though Daniel's words had lifted a weight off my shoulders. But as I unlocked the door to my room, my phone buzzed in my pocket. My heart leapt when I saw Michael's name on the screen. We need to talk. The message was short, blunt, and devoid of emotion, but it was more than I'd expected. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What did he want to say? Was he ready to talk about what happened, or was this just another chance for him to twist the knife? I took a deep breath and typed back, when and where. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place we used to go to on lazy Sunday mornings before everything fell apart. Michael was already seated when I arrived, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked tired, the bags under his eyes hinting at sleepless nights. I slid into the booth across from him, my heart pounding. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us like a storm cloud. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice low. "I wasn't sure I should," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "What do you want, Michael?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy? Why didn't you talk to me before it got to this point?" He looked down at his coffee, his hands tightening around the mug. "Because I didn't want to admit it. To you, to myself, to anyone. I thought if I just kept going, it would get better. But it didn't." I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat tightening. "And the credit card charges? The hotels, the jewelry? Who were they for?" He flinched, his silence more damning than any confession. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There was someone," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the table. "But it didn't mean anything. It wasn't what you think." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "It never is it? You made me feel like a monster for what I did, but you were doing the same thing the whole time." "It's not the same," he said, his voice rising defensively. "I didn't love her. I didn't build a relationship behind your back." "And that makes it okay?" I shot back, my anger boiling over. "You don't get to stand on some moral high ground, Michael. We both screwed up. The difference is, I'm not pretending to be the victim here." His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I used to know, the man I fell in love with. "I didn't know how to fix us," he said softly. "And I didn't want to lose you." "You already did," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "A long time ago." By the time I left the diner, I felt drained, as though the confrontation had wrung out every ounce of emotion I had left. But I also felt something else. Clarity. Michael and I were done. There was no going back, no salvaging what we'd lost. And for the first time, I was okay with that. I drove aimlessly after leaving the diner, the conversation with Michael replaying in my mind like a broken record. His voice, full of guilt and regret, lingered in my ears. But it wasn't enough. It was too late for apologies, too late to fix what had already been shattered. When I finally pulled into the motel parking lot, the neon vacancy sign flickering in the darkness, exhaustion washed over me. I climbed the stairs to my room, my limbs heavy with the weight of the day. Inside, the air was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the mini fridge. I dropped my bag by the door and sank onto the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. I knew I had made the right decision. Michael and I couldn't go back to what we once were, not after everything. But even as I told myself this, a hollow ache settled in my chest. For years, I had built my life around him, around us. And now, without him, I felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The only thing I was certain of was that I couldn't stay here, hiding in this dingy motel room while the rest of the world moved on. I needed to move forward too, even if I didn't know where forward would take me. The next morning I made a decision. I would go back to the house, not to beg Michael for forgiveness or to plead my case, but to gather the rest of my belongings and close that chapter of my life for good. I couldn't keep running away from the mess I'd made. It was time to face it, head on. When I pulled into the driveway, my stomach churned with nerves. The house stood silent and imposing, its windows reflecting the gray morning sky. I half expected Michael's mother to come storming out, ready to hurl more insults, but the house seemed empty. Still, the air was thick with the scent of lemon cleaner, a smell I instantly associated with Michael's. His words stung, but I pushed the feeling aside. "Well, now you won't have to worry about it." He crossed the room, stopping a few feet away from me. Claire, he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. I know I said some things the other night, things I can't take back, but I never wanted it to end like this. Neither did I said, my throat tightening, but here we are. For a moment he looked like he wanted to say more, but then he shook his head and stepped back. Do you need help with the boxes? I hesitated, unsure if I could handle the awkwardness of working side by side with him. But the thought of hauling everything to my car on my own was equally unappealing. Sure, I said finally. Thanks. We worked in near silence, the only sounds the rustling of cardboard and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was strange, this quiet cooperation after everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to break the silence, to ask him the questions that still lingered in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to open that door again. When the last box was loaded into my car, I turned to him, my heart pounding. I guess this is it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. Yeah, I guess it is. For a moment we just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. And then, without another word, I climbed into my car and drove away. That evening I found myself sitting on the motel bed, staring at the boxes piled in the corner. I should have felt relief, closure even, but all I felt was emptiness. I picked up my phone, scrolling aimlessly through my contacts until I landed on Daniel's name. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button. Part of me wanted to hear his voice, to let him fill the silence that had been pressing down on me all day. But another part of me knew I couldn't keep leaning on him like this. I needed to figure out how to stand on my own again. Instead of calling, I sent him a text, got my stuff. Thanks for being there these past few days. His reply came almost instantly. Always here for you. Call me if you need anything. I smiled faintly, tucking my phone away. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, not because of Daniel or Michael or anyone else, but because I realized I wasn't as lost as I thought. I had survived the worst of it. Now it was time to start rebuilding. And this time, I was going to do it on my own terms. The next few days were a blur of logistics. I secured a storage unit for the boxes of belongings I'd retrieved from Michael's house, knowing I wasn't ready to settle anywhere permanent just yet. My phone stayed mostly silent aside from the occasional check-in text from Daniel. I appreciated his kindness, but I found myself craving solitude more and more. I needed to rebuild myself, piece by piece, and I couldn't rely on anyone else to do it for me. On the third day, I got an unexpected call. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but I recognized it immediately. It was Michael's mother. My stomach tightened as I debated whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I swiped to accept. Her voice was sharp, even over the phone. "Claire, I think we need to have a conversation," I sighed, already regretting picking up. What could we possibly have to talk about? "You may not care about fixing this family, but I do," she snapped. "We can't just let everything fall apart because of your selfish mistakes." That afternoon, I drove to the jewelry store listed on the statement. The elegant storefront was a far cry from the simple, understated pieces Michael used to buy for me. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume. A sales associate greeted me with a warm smile, her name tag reading. "Welcome," she said, her tone professional yet friendly. "How can I help you today?" I hesitated, unsure of how to frame my question. Finally, I decided on the truth, or at least part of it. "I'm trying to track down a purchase that was made here recently. It's personal." Sophia nodded sympathetically. "Of course. Do you have the receipt or the purchaser's name?" I handed her the credit card statement, my fingers trembling slightly. It was charged to this card. She glanced at the paper, then typed something into the computer. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the screen. Ah, yes, that was a custom order. A diamond necklace, if I'm not mistaken. A diamond necklace. My stomach twisted. Michael had never bought me anything like that. Not for anniversaries, birthdays, or even our wedding. "Can you tell me who picked it up?" I asked, my voice tight. Sophia hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I really shouldn't, but—" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A woman signed for it. Blonde, early 30s, very well dressed. She said she was Mr. Collins' assistant." His assistant, of course. I clenched my jaw, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Michael had always insisted that his assistant, Nicole, was nothing more than a colleague, but I'd seen the way she looked at him during company events, the way her laughter lingered a little too long when he told a joke. "Thank you," I said, my voice strained. "That's all I needed to know." By the time I returned to the motel, my anger had reached a boiling point. Michael's infidelity wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was a fact. He had lied to me, to everyone, while letting me take the fall for our failed marriage. I sat on the bed, staring at the necklace details scribbled in my notebook. It was time to confront Michael once and for all. I couldn't let him or his mother control the narrative any longer. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Claire?" His voice was cautious, as if he knew what was coming. "We need to talk," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Now." He hesitated. I'm at work." "I don't care," I snapped. "This can't wait." An hour later, we were seated across from each other at a small coffee shop downtown. Michael looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid someone might see us. "Claire, what's this about?" he asked, his tone impatient. I pulled out my notebook and slapped it onto the table. "This is about the necklace, Michael. The one you bought for Nicole." His face paled, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. "I went to the store. I know everything." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, yes, I bought her a necklace, but it's not what you think." "Then what is it, Michael?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you are having an affair while pretending to be the victim." "It wasn't an affair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nicole, she's been going through a lot. I was just trying to help her." "By buying her diamonds?" I shot back. "Do you even hear yourself?" He looked away, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to hurt me? Michael, you've done nothing but hurt me." For the first time, I saw tears glimmer in his eyes. But I didn't care. I was done letting him manipulate me with half-truths and empty apologies. "I'm done, Michael," I said, standing. "You can keep your lies. I'm moving on." As I walked out of the cafe, a weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt free. As I walked away from the cafe, the realization hit me. This was it. I had faced Michael, confronted the lies, and finally broken the chains that had kept me tied to a marriage that had been unraveling for years. My chest felt lighter, even as my legs carried me shakily to my car. For so long, I had allowed guilt and shame to dictate my actions. But now, when I slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed on the console. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Daniel. How did it go? I hesitated, unsure how to sum up the whirlwind of emotions that the confrontation had stirred in me. Finally, I typed back, "It's over, for real this time." His response was immediate. "Proud of you. Want to talk about it?" I smiled faintly, the warmth of his words chasing away some of the lingering coldness from my meeting with Michael. "Not yet, but thank you." That evening, back in my motel room, I began to unpack the emotional weight of everything. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by boxes filled with pieces of my life. Photographs, journals, trinkets from vacations that now felt like they belonged to someone else. As I sifted through the memories, I came across an envelope tucked into the bottom of one of the boxes. My name was scrawled across the front in Michael's handwriting. For a moment, I considered throwing it away without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The letter was brief, but each word cut deep. Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I wrote it for myself more than for you, because I don't know how to say these things out loud. By the time you find this, things between us might already be broken. But I need you to know that I tried. I tried to love you the way you deserved. I tried to be enough for you. And when I realized I couldn't, I hated myself for it. I don't blame you for what happened. I just hope one day you'll understand why I couldn't let you stay. Michael. I stared at the letter, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Part of me wanted to tear it to pieces, to reject his attempt at absolution, but another part of me, one I wasn't ready to acknowledge, felt a flicker of understanding. Michael hadn't just been angry, he had been broken too, and in his own twisted way he had been trying to protect himself from more pain. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, my hands trembling. I wasn't ready to forgive him, but maybe, just maybe, I could begin to let go. The next morning, I decided it was time to start rebuilding. I couldn't stay in that motel forever, and I couldn't keep running from my problems. I needed to find a place to call my own, a space where I could figure out who I was without Michael, without his mother, without the weight of the past dragging me down. I spent the day scouring rental listings, my laptop open on the motel desk. Most of the places were too expensive or too far away, but one listing caught my eye, a small one-bedroom apartment just outside of town. The photos showed a cozy living space with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I called the landlord and arranged to see it the following day. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. It was faint, like the first light of dawn, but it was there. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that things might get better. The apartment was even better in person. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the hardwood floors gave the space a warm, inviting feel. The landlord, an older woman named Margaret, showed me around with a kind smile. "You'll love it here," she said, her voice soft but full of confidence. "The neighbors are quiet and the area is safe. It's a good place to start fresh." Her words struck a chord and I found myself nodding. I think this is exactly what I need. By the end of the tour, I had signed the lease and arranged to move in within the week. As I walked out of the building, the keys jingling in my pocket, I felt a spark of excitement. This was a new beginning, a chance to create a life on my own terms. Moving day came faster than I expected. Daniel offered to help, and though I hesitated at first, I eventually agreed. I didn't want to admit it, but I needed the support. He showed up at the motel that morning with a pickup truck and a wide grin. "Ready to make this place your own?" he asked, his tone lighthearted. I smiled, grateful for his positivity. "More than ready." We spent the day hauling boxes and furniture into the apartment. By the time we were done, I was exhausted, but the sight of my belongings filling the empty space filled me with a sense of accomplishment. "You did good," Daniel said as we stood in the living room, surveying the chaos of unpacked boxes and scattered furniture. "This place suits you." "Thanks," I said, my voice soft. "And thanks for helping. I don't think I could have done this without you." "You don't have to do it alone," he replied, his eyes meeting mine. "You've got people who care about you. Don't forget that." His words stayed with me long after he left. As I sat on the couch that night, surrounded by the remnants of my old life, I realized he was right. I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, I was stronger than I thought. The days that followed were a blur of unpacking and settling in. Each box I opened felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I hung photos on the walls, placed books on the shelves, and arranged the furniture just the way I liked it. Slowly but surely. One evening, as I was unpacking a box of kitchen supplies, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Daniel. "How's the new place treating you?" I smiled, typing back, "It's good, feels like home." I even started taking photos again. His reply came quickly. "That's great. You always had an eye for it. We should celebrate soon." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Daniel had been a rock for me during everything with Michael, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to explore whatever was growing between us. Still, I didn't want to push him away. "I'd like that," I typed back, keeping it simple. A few days later, Daniel and I met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. The atmosphere was cozy and intimate, with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did with him. "You seem lighter," he said at one point, his eyes studying me, "like a weight's been lifted." I smiled, taking a sip of wine. "I think it has. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm starting to find myself again." He nodded, his expression warm. "You deserve that, Claire. You deserve to be happy." His words touched something deep inside me, and I found myself reaching across the table to take his hand. "Thank you," I said softly, "for everything." "Vaika." He squeezed my hand gently, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could be here for you." As the evening wound down, we walked back to my apartment together. The air was crisp, and the city lights cast a soft glow over the streets. When we reached my door, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Do you want to come in?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, his eyes warm. "Only if you're sure." "I'm sure," I said, unlocking the door. Inside, the apartment felt even cozier than usual. We sat on the couch, the conversation continuing late into the night, and for the first time, I let myself imagine a future, one that didn't involve Michael or the pain of the past, a future that was entirely my own. Daniel stayed late that night, not in the way one might expect after an intimate dinner, but in the quiet, comforting way he always did. We talked for hours, sitting side by side on the couch, our voices soft as the city hummed faintly outside the windows. He didn't push, didn't press for anything more than what I was ready to give. It was one of the many things I admired about him, his patience, When he finally stood to leave, I walked him to the door. He lingered there for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the door. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he said, his voice low. "I'll see you soon." I nodded, my heart warm. "Definitely. Good night, Dan." "Good night," said, his gaze lingering on me for just a second longer before he stepped out into the cool night. I locked the door behind him, leaning against it with a deep sigh. Something had shifted between us that evening. Not a seismic change, but a subtle, undeniable shift. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt open to the possibilities. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. I threw myself into my photography with a passion I hadn't felt in years. I started taking on small freelance projects, family portraits, engagement shoots, even a few commercial gigs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me busy and give me a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as I was editing a batch of photos at my kitchen table, my phone buzzed. It was an email notification, a client inquiry. My heart leapt when I saw the name, Bright Horizons Marketing. It was a mid-sized firm I had been admiring for years, known for their vibrant, creative campaigns. The email: "Hi Claire, we came across your work and love your style. We're looking for a photographer to collaborate on an upcoming project. Are you available to meet next week to discuss?" Best, Leah Carter, Creative Director. I stared at the screen, rereading the email several times. This was the kind of opportunity I had dreamed about, the kind that could launch my career to the next level. My fingers flew over the keyboard as I typed out a response. Hi, Leah. Thank you so much for reaching out. I would love to discuss the project. I'm available next Tuesday or Wednesday. Please let me know what works best for you. Looking forward to connecting, Claire. I hit send, my heart racing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about the future, not just cautiously optimistic, but genuinely, heart-racingly excited. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, I decided to call Daniel. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Hey Claire, what's up? I got an email today, I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. Bright Horizons Marketing wants to meet with me for a project. That's amazing, he said, his enthusiasm genuine. I told you, you're talented, Claire. This is just the beginning. Thank you, I said softly. I'm still nervous, though. What if I'm not good enough? Stop that, he said firmly. You've got this. They wouldn't have reached out if they didn't believe in your work. Trust me, you're gonna crush it. His confidence in me was infectious, and I found myself smiling. I hope so. It just feels like everything's finally starting to fall into place, you know? That's because you're finally letting it, he said, his tone gentle. You've worked hard for this, Claire. You deserve every bit of it. Thank you, I said again, my voice thick with emotion. For always believing in me. Always, he replied. Now, go celebrate. You've earned it. The meeting with Bright Horizons went better than I could have hoped. Leah was warm and welcoming, her passion for the project infectious. She explained that they were launching a new campaign for a local nonprofit, and they needed a photographer to capture authentic, emotional moments for their marketing materials. I think your style is perfect for this, Leah said, sliding a mood board across the table. We're looking for something raw and real, something that tells a story, and your work does that beautifully. I glanced at the mood board, my excitement building with each image. This was exactly the kind of project I had always wanted to do, something meaningful, something that could make a difference. I'd love to be part of this, I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. Wonderful, Leah said, her smile widening. We'll send over the contract this afternoon. Welcome aboard, Claire. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. I threw myself into the project with everything I had, spending hours researching, brainstorming, and scouting locations. The work was challenging but exhilarating, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Daniel was a constant source of support throughout the process. He'd check in regularly, offering words of encouragement or simply listening as I talked through my ideas. One evening, he even joined me on a location scouting trip, his easy humor making the long day fly by. You're amazing, you know that? He said, as we stood on a hill overlooking the city, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink. I laughed, shaking my head. I think you're biased. Maybe, he said, grinning, but I'm also right. I turned to him, my heart swelling with gratitude. I don't know what I'd do without you, Daniel. You'll never have to find out, he said softly, his gaze steady and unwavering. As the project neared completion, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The Claire who had sat in that motel room weeks ago, broken and unsure of her future, felt like a distant memory. I was still healing, still figuring things out. One evening, as I reviewed the final set of photos for the campaign, I received a text from Michael. It was short and to the point. I'm happy for you. You deserve this. I stared at the message for a long moment, my emotions swirling. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, but for the first time I felt at peace with that. Michael and I were part of each other's past, and that's where it would stay. The campaign launched a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. The photos were featured on billboards and magazines and across social media. Seeing my work out in the world, making an impact, was more fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. And through it all, Daniel was there, steady, supportive, and quietly cheering me on. One night, as we sat on the couch in my apartment, he took my hand in his and smiled. "You're incredible, Claire. You know that, right?" I smiled back, my heart full. Maybe I'm starting to believe it. As he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine, I realized something. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was a whole new book, and for the first time I couldn't wait to see where the story would go. Smiling, "It feels good to dream again. Congratulations, Claire," he said, his voice sincere. "This is incredible." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand. "It means a lot that you came." We exchanged a few polite words before he left, and as I watched him walk away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. We had both moved on, and for the first time, I could look at him without anger or regret. As the studio grew, so did my confidence. I threw myself into my work, capturing moments that told stories. Weddings, graduations, quiet family gatherings. Each photo felt like a celebration of life, and every client left with more than just a picture. They left with a piece of my heart. Daniel was by my side every step of the way. He'd stop by the studio after work, bringing me coffee or dinner when I was too busy to leave. Sometimes he'd sit in the corner and watch me work, his presence a calming force in the chaos of my schedule. One evening, as we cleaned up after a particularly long day, he leaned against the counter and watched me pack up my camera gear. "You know," he said, his tone casual, "I've never seen you this happy." I looked up, a smile tugging at my lips. "I've never felt this happy." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Claire, I've been thinking about us." My heart skipped a beat, but I nodded for him to continue. "I know we've been taking things slow, and I wouldn't change that for anything, but I also know that I'm ready for whatever comes next. With you, whenever you're ready." He stood at the altar, his eyes locked on mine, his expression a mix of awe and love that made my breath catch. Time seemed to slow as I walked toward him, each step a reminder of the journey that had led me here. The doubts, the heartbreak, the pain, it had all been worth it for this moment. When I finally reached him, he took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. The officiant began to speak, but her words faded into the background as I looked at him, the man who had been my anchor in the storm. "Hi," he whispered, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. As we exchanged vows, the world seemed to fall away. Each word felt like a promise carved into stone, a declaration of love built on trust, patience, and the lessons we had learned together. When Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand steady despite the emotion in his eyes, I felt a surge of warmth so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant said, her voice breaking through the haze of emotion. Daniel pulled me close, his hands cradling my face as he kissed me, soft and sweet and filled with the kind of love that heals. The crowd erupted into cheers, but all I could hear was the sound of his heartbeat as I pressed my forehead to his. "I love you," he murmured, his voice steady despite the tears glistening in his eyes. "I love you too," I whispered, my own tears finally spilling over. The reception was a blur of laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts. Megan delivered a hilarious speech that had everyone in stitches, while Daniel's best friend told a story about the first time Daniel mentioned me, a tale that left no doubt about how deeply he had fallen for me, even in those early days. "To Claire and Daniel," he said, raising his glass, "may your love continue to grow and may you always remind each other why you chose to be together in the first place." As the night wore on, Daniel and I stole quiet moments together amidst the festivities. At one point, he pulled me onto the dance floor, wrapping his arms around me as a slow song played. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Davis?" he asked, his breath warm against my ear. I laughed, the sound light and carefree. "I think I like the sound of that." "Good," he said, spinning me gently before pulling me back into his arms. "Because I plan to call you that every day for the rest of my life." We swayed together under the string lights, the rest of the world fading away. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Later, as the reception wound down and the guests began to trickle out, Daniel and I slipped away to a quiet corner of the garden. The air was cool and fragrant, the stars twinkling above us like 1,000 tiny promises. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his hand intertwining with mine. I turned to him, my heart full. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." He smiled, leaning in to kiss me. It was a kiss filled with everything we had been through together, the heartbreak, the healing, the hope for the future. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The next morning, we left for a small, quiet honeymoon on the coast. It was exactly what we needed, a chance to unplug from the world and focus on each other. We spent our days walking along the beach, our feet sinking into the cool sand as the waves lapped at the shore. At night, we'd sit on the balcony of our cozy little cottage, watching the sun set over the ocean as we talked about our dreams for the future. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind?" I asked, lacing my fingers with his. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice soft, "about how far you've come, about how proud I am of you." My heart swelled and I smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you." "That's not true," he said, shaking his head. "You've had this strength in you all along, Claire. All I did was remind you of it." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I love you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I love you too," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. For Daniel, for the life we were building together, and for the strength it had taken to get here. This was more than just a new chapter. It was a new beginning. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. Because no matter what came next, I knew I would face it with the man I loved by my side.